So this meeting will be recorded and will be posted to our revision website, which is that QR code that you see there in the corner. There will be closed captioning as well. It's kind of not 100% accurate, but hopefully we'll have that option on the recorded version. Please keep your microphones turned off for the duration of the meeting until our question and answer session, when we can call on you and have that interactive session at that time. Next slide. So just some Zoom tips and tricks, and we'll highlight these buttons a little bit more when we're done with our presentation as well. But there is the Q&A button to submit questions to the revision team anytime throughout the presentation. The chat's going to be used for relevant website links and mailing addresses. And if you experience any technical issues, you can also reach out through that chat option. And the raise hand, which is under the reactions for a lot of the versions of Zoom, will be used during that question and answer session. If you do want to ask a verbal question, that just allows me to call on you, and then you can unmute at that time. Next slide. So as I said, this evening we have Kiana Warren, who is with us, and she is a senior planner also with the Pacific Planning Service Group. And so I will hand it off to her for our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to everyone who is joining tonight. I wanted to introduce myself really quickly. I am the Pacific Planning Service Group Climate Change Specialist, and the Pacific Planning Service Group is a section of the Forest Service that deals with forest plan revisions for Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and California. I am based in Portland, Oregon, and I've been working with the Forest Service for over 10 years now, mostly in forestry and climate change and planning. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about where climate fits into the plan revision process and sort of where we are in that process. We're still very early, so unfortunately I don't have a lot of specific details or plan actions or anything to share with you. But the good news is that because we're on the early end, we're also still incorporating feedback and suggestions. So right now we're in the assessment phase. That's sort of the first phase of the plan revision process. And that assessment isn't planned to be finished until January. So right now we're working on sort of the initial outlines and gathering information. And then after that point, we'll be drafting the actual plans that will also be going for public review. All right, so climate and carbon and plan revision. So what I'm going to focus on tonight is a lot of the relevant policies. There have been a number of policies that have come out in the last 10 or so years. And I'll talk a little bit about the application and the plan process. I'll go into that in a bit of detail so folks have an idea of where we're coming from and where this is being grounded. And then I'll cover a little bit about what we're doing. Again, we're still pretty early, so that section is going to be a little bit on the shorter side for this presentation. All right, so quick summary of what the relevant policies are that relate to climate change inclusion in forest plan revision. The big one is the 2012 planning rule. The planning rule is what the Forest Service uses essentially to conform to the National Forest Management Act. So there's the larger act, and then within that, the Forest Service issues these different, and the CEQ issues these different rules for how we go about meeting those. So the 2012 planning rule established pretty clear direction to include climate change effects in plan revisions, including incorporating how we would deal with those effects into the different plan components, into that planned language that we develop. The 2012 planning rule also established direction to include baseline carbon assessments in the plan revisions and to analyze and estimate what those carbon effects might be in the alternatives. Then from that, two subsequent executive orders and several CEQ, that's the Council of Environmental Quality, part of the White House, Federal Register notices have further established the intent to include anticipated climate change effects when analyzing those current conditions. So that's sort of that step-down guidance. And the CEQ and the agency have been continually releasing new guidance related to this analysis. And the Forest Service recently, a couple of years ago in 2022, released a climate change adaptation plan with action, some of the actions of which are relevant to the LMP revision. LMP is Land Management Plan. Some of them are not relevant to LMP revision, i.e. they're more operational, they're more about staffing, but many are relevant to plan revision. All right, so I'll cover some of the executive orders first, because those are a little more cut and dry and high level. So there was Executive Order 14072 in 2022, which was the strengthening the nation's forest communities and local economies. There is the Executive Order from 2021, 13990, protecting public health and environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. And then in the CEQ in 2021, in response to that EO, it's a sort of policy jargon. It had, there was previous guidance that stated certain things would be pulled, and it reinstated those guidance. So there's been kind of this policy back and forth dialogue in the last few years. And where we are right now is that there's very clear guidance to be considering climate change in our forest plan revisions and our actions. So in 2022, then there was a step down from the USDA secretary who issued a memo and calling on the Forest Service to ensure climate resilience and carbon stewardship considerations are integrated into forest planning. And the adaptation plan the Forest Service has worked on is the first sort of departmental plan, departmental regulation that it's internal guidance about how the agency should incorporate different climate change adaptation considerations into our operations. And one of the ways that it approached this is it identified 6 key risks for the agency, and then several adaptation actions and sub-actions tiered to these. So some of those risks and key adaptation actions are adapting to changing fire regimes and extreme events and disturbances, preparing ecosystems, watersheds, and infrastructure for these changes, sustaining and improving ecosystem and watershed function in the face of chronic stressors, and supporting delivery of products and services in a changing climate. All right, so I'm going to shift a little bit now to the 2012 planning rule, because this definitely provides a lot more of that kind of capital D directive for us to follow when we're conducting our plan revision processes. So this provides regulations for implementing NIFMA, like I mentioned before. 2012 planning rule guides land management plan revisions and amendments, and then there are planning rule directives, the Forest Service handbook that ties directly to this. So the purposes and needs for the rule, it emphasizes restoration of natural resources to make our Forest Service lands more resilient to climate change, protect water resources, and improve forest health. That's sort of the overall guiding process. It creates a responsive planning process that informs integrated resource management and allows the Forest Service to adapt to changing conditions, including climate change. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail in a lot of the direction on what this means. One of the things that the 2012 planning rule is very big on is the role of science. And you'll hear the term BASI a lot. That's best available scientific information as an acronym. And so we are definitely beholden to using BASI and identifying what is and what isn't BASI to inform the planning process in this subpart. And there's different criteria that we have to evaluate what is or what isn't best available scientific information. Is it accurate? Is it relevant in space and time? Is it reliable? All right, a little more on the 2012 planning rule and climate change. Adaptive management is a framework that can support adaptation to climate change. I want to be a little clear on these terms. Adaptive management is a concept that's been around for a while, and that's using different forms of monitoring and writing in language to the plan that allows for some flexibility to adapt what we're doing based on that feedback and that monitoring information. Whereas adaptation, climate change adaptation, is our actions that are specifically geared toward improving resilience or addressing or responding to the climate change. And so one of the things I wanted to mention is that this planning rule supersedes the previous planning rule. The previous planning rule had been very heavy on sort of objectives, targets, et cetera. This one is much more focused on ecosystem resilience, ecosystem integrity, and I'll talk a little more about that. But it focuses more on how do we get to desired conditions for sustainability. So one of those things is it requires consideration of system drivers and stressors, and those drivers are the dominant ecological processes and disturbance regimes. Stressors might include invasive species and climate change. And also the planning rule requires that we consider the ability of the plan area to adapt to change. So it's definitely focused on ecological processes and incorporating that into our plan ultimately. So going into that first stage, the assessment, which is where we're at now, we're at the very beginning of the assessment. Assessments are pretty well defined in the planning rule, in the 2012 planning rule. And the intent is to rapidly evaluate existing information about relevant ecological, economic, and social conditions and sustainability of their relationship to the current land management plan. And so I wanted to emphasize that it's definitely focused on evaluating existing information and not doing more research or field research to gain more information in order to do an assessment. And so the language in the 2012 planning rules that the responsible official shall consider and evaluate existing and possible future conditions and trends, i.e. potentially due to climate change, of the plan area and assess the sustainability of those different systems within the plan area. A little more about the assessment. There are 15 required topics that it lays out. And like I said, one of those things is including information about system drivers and stressors. And it needs to be in the context that is relevant to other assessment topics that are required, including assessing for ecological integrity, ecological sustainability, and social and economic sustainability. So again, and this is definitely belaboring this, the assessment should identify drivers and stressors that influence the plan area, opportunities to reduce risk and adapt to those drivers, stressors, and climate change, and also the risk, stressors, and drivers affecting social and economic sustainability, not just ecological. The interdisciplinary team should assess the predominant climate regimes, assess stressors that impair key ecosystem characteristics, use existing information, identify gaps, uncertainties, and assumptions, identify uncharacteristic conditions that influence those drivers, and consider future perturbations like drought and disturbances to watersheds and water resources. Of note, for an assessment, there are other reports that can be utilized in the assessment. One of the things that the agency has been doing quite a bit is utilizing and creating climate change vulnerability assessments for different geographic areas. And this would be a separate document, but if it is available at the time that the assessment is going on, it can definitely feed very well into the assessment phase when analyzing when assessing for climate change and climate change risks. So the 2012 planning rule is clear that the interdisciplinary team should use any existing climate change information, such as vulnerability assessments and scenario planning. And I'll come back to this a little bit in the what we are doing section. So moving on a little bit from adaptation and consideration of climate change into, for purposes of adaptation, into more of the mitigation, what is the role of the forest in preventing climate change, i.e. consideration of carbon. Carbon sequestration and storage is recognized in the 2012 planning rule as an ecosystem service provided by forests, and the responsible official shall identify and assess available information relevant to the plan area for a baseline assessment of carbon stocks. And there's some guidance in that 2012 planning rule about what this assessment of carbon stocks needs to include. The plan area needs, we need to include information about how the plan area plays a role in sequestering and storing carbon. We need to include information about how disturbances, projects, and activities influence carbon stocks in the past and how they may influence them in the future, where the carbon is stored, how that storage is changing, and how the storage could be influenced by management, for example, in different alternatives in the plan development. So the interdisciplinary team may consider whether existing conditions and trends of vegetation indicate that the plan area is a carbon sink or source, and the future trend of the plan area in sequestering and storing carbon under existing plan guidance. And these are part of the assessment. Also part of the assessment is to make sure that we identify the influences on carbon stocks, including the effect of disease, insects, growth, management, timber harvest, vegetation, wildfire, All of those different disturbances obviously have effect on the carbon storage and sequestration. The assessment may include potential changes over time of carbon stocks and pools. An example of potential information sources might come from wildfire history maps or other information, forest health information, timber harvest cut and sold reports, or other vegetation data and reports. So for plan development related to carbon, the plans must provide for ecological, economic, and social sustainability. It must maintain or restore ecological integrity that accounts for climate change as a system driver and stressor. It must maintain and restore structure, function, composition, and watershed of terrestrial aquatic ecosystems and watersheds. And all of those are more for the adaptation side. And then also it must provide for regulation services such as long-term storage of carbon and climate regulation. So these are things laid out in the 2012 planning rule. To note, it is not prescriptive on, what level of storage or carbon sink the forest must be, but it must incorporate consideration of these aspects in the plan development. So again, a little bit more about thinking about integration of sustainability and ecological integrity, some of these cornerstones of the 2012 planning rule, the plan development. The plan components that maintain and restore ecosystem integrity, considering various factors, including system drivers and stressors. These are things that we have to include in there. We have to have plan components that are geared towards maintaining and restoring ecosystem integrity. And again, we're thinking about climate change. It's not prescriptive on what this means. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be resistance or resilience or transition, if folks are familiar with those terms. But we must be thinking about what does integrity mean in the future and how do we maintain that? And also for social and economic sustainability. There's a definition for ecosystem integrity, the quality or condition of an ecosystem when its dominant ecological characteristics, for example, composition, structure, function, connectivity, and species composition and diversity, occur within the natural range of variation and can withstand and recover from most perturbations imposed by natural environmental dynamics or human influence. All right. So again, thinking about some of the directives that tier from that 2012 planning rule, there's a few different aspects that I wanted to pull out here. And this is all language from that Forest Service handbook. In light of possible changes in species composition under the effects of climate change and with a focus on restoration, the agency designs plan components to provide ecological conditions to sustain functional ecosystems based on a future viewpoint. Agency intent is to promote ecosystem integrity in the plan area. However, it may not be possible or appropriate to strive for returning key characteristics to past conditions throughout the plan area. And the plan could provide options to deviate from the natural range of variation, including conditions that rarely or never occurred in the past, but can be managed for in the future, will better contribute to long-term economic ecosystem sustainability and adaptation to the effects of a changing climate. All right. So some of the questions that guide us as we're developing these plan components are considering how might climate change affect the key ecological characteristics that we use to define and determine ecological integrity. We might ask ourselves, how might climate change affect ecological, social, and economic sustainability? We need to ask ourselves how conditions, trends, and stressors, and how do we consider those when determining inherent capability of the land? And we need to review any climate change vulnerability assessments, projections, forest assessments, and monitoring, looking for climate-related vulnerabilities, identifying potential adaptive management approaches, and designing plan components that sustain those key ecosystem characteristics, support resilience, and at-risk species. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the components of a plan are. The 2012 planning rule provided a lot of guidance on this. And what you see on the right in this chart are the different names of and buckets of those different plan components. So the plan components should respond to vulnerabilities that are identified in the assessment and then the need to change. So the way it flows is once we've assessed the current conditions, including climate change and some of those projected conditions, then from that, we can determine what we think needs to change. And then from that, when we write a plan, it should be responsive to that. And one of the first things that we need to do is identify what our desired conditions are. And this could reflect a range of conditions if we consider climate change to deal with the dynamic ecological systems or changing social and environmental needs or economic needs. We may need to look at scenarios to address uncertainty with climate change, where we know climate change is happening, but as far as the degree and to where and exactly how it will manifest is quite an uncertainty. And so that's something that we need to consider when we're developing specific management actions. We need to consider where are the ecosystem changes within our acceptable limits. Are there going to be ecosystem changes in certain areas that are outside of our desired conditions? Should desired conditions be expanded to accommodate those changes? And where do we want to limit those changes? And what does that mean for imposing standards and guidelines? So again, thinking about plan components of plan development and carbon in the 2012 planning rule, the plans must provide for ecological sustainability and ecological integrity, including nutrient cycling and retention. It also needs to include for social and economic sustainability, including those ecosystem services, within which storage of carbon and climate regulation and soil formation and nutrient cycling are included. Another component of the plan that we need to consider as we're developing it is the monitoring section. There are 8 required topics, one of which is including measurable changes in the plan area related to climate change and other stressors that may be affecting the plan area. And so, for example, 2016 monitoring strategy on transition might say, what are the status and trends of snowpack and precipitations in precipitation in the planning area? We might develop monitoring questions based on this. So some take homes related to some of the updates in policy in the last few years. We have requirements to consider climate change as a system driver and stressor. The plan should support restoring and maintaining ecosystem integrity and adaptation to changing conditions, with careful consideration of those key ecosystem characteristics and the natural range of variation. And the types of plan components have changed from the 1982 rule. And I went over those. That's the desired conditions, your goals, standards, and guidelines, et cetera. And those will be different from the current plan based on that structure. So I want to get a little bit into what we are doing, again, with the reminder that we're very early in the process. So one thing that we're doing is the Forest Service Research Station is about to finish a climate change vulnerability assessment for Southeast Alaska. And that should come out in about a month. So we don't have all of the details from that yet, but it comes out in time for us to be able to integrate that into the Tongass National Forest assessment. So that's going to be really helpful. We have in our assessment, we have 2 relevant chapters to this presentation. One is the drivers, stressors, and climate change, where we'll be assessing all those different aspects. We have another chapter that will be about carbon storage and sequestration. And then we have, and then from there, when we're done with the assessment, we move on to plan development. And then once we have the plan, then we move into analysis. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about how some of that process works. The red arrows are sort of a you are here. We're currently in the plan assessment, and while doing that, we are gathering information for carbon stock assessment and also climate change vulnerability assessment. And I'll get a little more into the details there, but from there, then we talk about climate change vulnerabilities addressed. We try to address those climate change vulnerabilities identified in the assessment and the vulnerability assessment. And then from there, we analyze our proposed action in the NEPA process. So what we are doing right now in the assessment, so in our climate change, our driver stressors and climate change chapter, we will be integrating climate change vulnerability assessment information that's being written by the Forest Service Research Station. And we'll be considering climate change effects, and I have in here across RCPs. RCPs is the representative concentration pathway, which is basically looking at potential futures. And, there's a scenario one, which is the whole world starts emitting less carbon. And then there's, our business as usual scenario, right? So there's a range of possible concentrations that we expect in the future for carbon. And this obviously will have a big impact on what kinds of effects we see. So the vulnerability assessment has some ranges built in for this. So some of the information that it will include is impacts on temperature, impacts on precipitation amounts and patterns. And then we'll do some, as much as we can, derivation of effects on flooding, landslide, wind, insect and disease dynamics, et cetera. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and some of it may be qualitative, but we'll do what we can to include those. Like I said, there's not, excuse me, always great information or projections available, for example, effects on wind patterns, but we will say what we do and what we don't know, and what we can and what we can't anticipate. For the carbon side, there are several different methods of analyzing for carbon as a baseline. Most of the national forests in the lower 48 have a whole bunch of what we call FIA plots, which is the Forest Inventory and Analysis program that's run through the research stations, where it's not really dense, but most of the national forest area is covered. And so they have data going back 100 years on forest growth and change, and over most of the forest types within those boundaries. The Tongass is a little bit different. Most of the FIA plots cover areas where we do active forest management, so it doesn't cover the entire forest, but we are utilizing those FIA plot data as much as we can in order to create the baseline. Those lower 48 states, because they have all of that data, have been able to produce what you might hear of as carbon white papers. So they have these essentially baseline analyses already and handy. But we are working with folks in our Washington, D.C. office who have their hands on all that FIA data. So that's one method that we're using to provide some estimates of carbon storage on the Tongass, and also change with disturbance. We're also considering basically any other method or study that we can find, so that we can provide sort of the range of estimates of what the Tongass stores and sequesters. And some of these are based on field plot data, and some of these are based on remote sensing estimates, where you can get satellite imagery and a few ground-based plots, but be able to sort of interpolate over the landscape how much carbon you would estimate the forest holds. Again, I touched a little bit on some of the limitations to the available data on the Tongass. It's a challenge, but that's part of why we're very open to providing sort of a range of estimates that folks have done. So some of the topic areas that we're going to include are current carbon storage and how that has changed over time. The effect of disturbance and forest aging dynamics. Obviously, forests that are young tend to grow faster than when they're old, but when they're old, they store more carbon. And so what is the effect of some of those disturbances and changing sort of the age, structure, and trajectory? We're also planning to include above ground, what are known as above ground pools. So the trees that you see, the shrubs, the duff, et cetera, as well as some information, even if it is qualitative to some degree, on below ground pools, including soil. And on our working group, we have a soil scientist who has published pretty widely on carbon and soil. So that's a huge asset for us there. So some of the challenges with developing both of these chapters on the Tongass is that we have incomplete data. We would love to have more data, data going back further, more denser data, all of that. And then obviously uncertainty, especially when it comes to projections. And then not just uncertainty related to simply temperature, but how that would play out in dynamics like wind and insect and disease response. We obviously know that insects and disease have responded to drought quite a bit in a lot of other locations. We don't necessarily know how that will play out locally, but we do know change will happen. And so, how do we write a plan that will be responding to change when we still also have this uncertainty. So that's sort of the $1 million question that we'll be working on as we work on our plan development. So as we develop the plan, there's a couple of things that we need to think about. So thinking about climate change adaptation, what we'll need to do is take a first step. And there's a product out there that's really helpful in thinking through project level adaptation considerations that we'll use for this, and that's the adaptation workbook. And what it guides is to think first about what your goals and objectives are generally for the landscape, right? And that ties in really well with the 2012 planning rule, thinking about those desired conditions. Then also assessing the climate impacts and vulnerabilities, and then evaluating whether those goals and objectives are possible or feasible considering the climate impacts. And then if they are, or if they're not, what kind of adaptation approaches or tactics do we need to be able to make those happen? Or what kind of adjustments do we need to make in our expectations, in our desired conditions, in order to make them reasonable in the face of climate change? And then on top of that, how do we monitor the effectiveness of those tactics and implemented actions in order for us to be able to make adjustments? And if we're going to make adjustments, how do we include that language in the plan? So that's for adaptation. And so as we do that, we'll be making sure to use that climate change vulnerability assessment in the assessment to incorporate those climate projections and impacts and vulnerabilities. We'll be incorporating the vulnerabilities and risks into that need to change document that drive us to those different plan components. And we want to be developing specific plan components that are responsive to those identified vulnerabilities. So like I said, are the desired conditions and objectives described in the plan likely to be achievable given projected climate changes and vulnerabilities? So then the next step after we develop the plan will be to do the environmental analysis of each of our different alternatives. And what we will need to do is to analyze for the effects of management, that the effects management will have on carbon for one. And it's unclear if this is going to be quantitative or qualitative. It kind of depends on what information and modeling might be available. But we might be able to make some qualitative comparisons about, this might store more carbon, this might store less carbon, things like that. And we'll also need to include the effects of climate change as we're analyzing the different the alternatives effects on ecosystem resilience. All right. So again, this is to be taken at a broad scale. For the whole forest, we're not drafting specific project actions. This is more to direct what kinds of projects and what kinds of actions we want to see. And I will turn it over to Erin.
All righty. Thank you, Kiana. If you want to go to the next slide. Maybe the next one. All right, just to review those buttons for everyone, if you're new to the Zoom land, you do have that Q&A button that should show up when you hover near the bottom of the screen. So you can type your questions into that Q&A box so we can help answer any questions you have. And or if you want to ask a verbal question, please just raise your hand so I can call on you so then you can unmute and ask your question. But with that, we open up the floor to any questions that you might have. We haven't had any come into the chat yet, so feel free to either type that in there or speak up or raise your hand so I can call you. Yes, Johnny, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you for the presentation. I couldn't find the yellow. I'm not a Zoom guy. I hang out in Google Meet most times, so
yeah,
sorry
no
about
worries.
that. It's like, yeah, everybody's zooming. So, but I had some questions for you if you don't mind. I'm not part of a activist group or anything. I'm just a citizen here in Craig, Alaska, and for a long time I've been concerned about, I guess, the ambiguity behind the word climate and carbon. And so I'm particularly interested in what you guys are speaking about here, and as it relates to, um, I've been to 3 of the meetings here on Prince of Wales, and so learned a lot from the slide presentation there. And one of the things I'm noticing here, I just would like to get an idea of. It seems to be that the EOs that are driving the conversation, the rules, the regs, it skips over 2018. During the Trump era, it goes from the Obama era, hops over the Trump era, it goes straight into Biden, and then we're in a big, huge hurry to do something before the next election. Is what it seems like to me. I might be reading it wrong, but I was told that T-Lump. I'm old enough to be around when T-Lump was happening in Ketchikan in '97. That was an interesting process. So I'm a little bit more, focused on what's going on this time around due to the ramifications of that last process. And so it's mentioned that in 2018 we had those giant meetings, and I went to them about the roadless, and there's no mention of them in the context of what we're doing now. And so I guess my question is, what's the rush? It seems like we're in a rush, like we got to just get the data in as quick as possible, when in fact there's an election coming up. And so me personally, it just feels like there is a kind of a ideological driven push for it. And there are some things that I see, it's a really politically hot button issue, climate. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to know, when you say carbon, are you referring to carbon as in CO2, or carbon as a part of the hydrocarbon chemistry makeup? When you say carbon, what are you talking about? Because to me, it's just kind of rote carbon trading carbon. This is it CO2 that we're talking about? If it is CO2 that we're talking about, a lot of people can put that in the context. Well, hey, hang on, we breathe that every day. It's part of what plants eat, and it just seems like it's not that part of the discussion seems to not be the focus, yet it's the driver. And so personally, if I heard the word carbon instead of, if it's CO2 we're talking about, I'd like to see it referred to as CO2, so we can actually put it in the context of, hey, yeah, it's an inert gas that we've all learned about in elementary science. That's the problem, and then we can discuss whether or not it is a problem. And so that, I hope that not to be too ideological, but I just sense that there is ideology behind it. And where it really kind of got me like, okay, I got to say something about this. We have current timber stands in Alaska that are actually sitting idle. And the reason they're sitting idle is that we're in a trading scheme with Californian NGOs to trade carbon credits. So I'm looking at that. I'm just like, are we like going down the road of building a hollow economy? Because that in itself, trading carbon credits to not cut lumber down and turn it into wood, it just scares me to bits, because I don't know why we're doing it. But I know enough about macroeconomics to know if you ignore your own resources, you really are. I got to wonder where we're going here. So that was the other thing too, is just like when I saw that we have current timber stands, we have political discussions about future timber stands being held idle in trade for this. I don't know. I would call it a different kind of currency other than the U.S. dollar. It kind of seems a little odd. So, and then sorry to carry on, but one more tiny thing I'd like to see discussed is that when it comes to the carbon sink, CO2 sink, I've heard, and I'm not an expert, that's why I'm here to hear what you have to say, but I have not heard anybody mention the fact that second growth timber is actually thirstier for CO2 than old growth timber, which would actually perfectly fit into the need to have timber harvesting. And also an increase in CO2 level on the planet actually increases the greening of the planet, which in effect increases the absorption of CO2 as a sink. And so there's a balancing act there. And, you know, again, I'm old enough to remember that it was climate, the earth was going to get cold and freeze, and then the earth was going to get hot. And now we've just called it climate change. We don't know which way it's going. It's just something's going to happen. We have to do something about it. So I'd love to see more, I guess, more of a peeling back the layers on whether or not it's true that second growth timber absorbs more CO2 than the old growth that's kind of old and not growing as much anymore.
Okay. All right, Johnny, maybe I should stop you there because you threw a lot of questions at us. So let me try to make sure we're hitting all those. And then you can let us know if we missed any, if that sounds good. All right, so I think the first one was timeline. Like what timeline we're looking at for this. I maybe I'll just touch on that first, Kiana, and then I'll hand it off to you because I think the next was identifying what carbon we're talking about. But just to touch on the timeline, we're not in a rush. Hopefully we haven't given that perception. This is not a, if you were part of the previous planning process, you know, this isn't a quick kind of process that we're going through. We've only started the assessment phase. So we are working to address those current trends and conditions. So we're just in that data gathering stage of this multi-year process. So from there, then we move into that plan development, and of course the National Environmental Policy Act process and the draft plan. So we're not thinking of finishing this up anytime soon. We're hoping 2027, 28. So just to get some reassurance on that, we're hopefully not trying to rush anything, and that's why we're trying to have these webinars and all these community workshops to get that input from everyone. But I think, Kiana, hopefully you were taking notes, but I think the next one was on identifying what carbon we were talking about. And then I think we then moved into the a little bit about carbon credits, and then also the second growth, if I caught everything. So I'll
I
give it
have
up to
a
you.
few more questions on that in there, but I will go through them in roughly the order that I heard them. So the first question I heard is, are we skipping over political eras? And I would say, I mean, yes and no. The current executive orders that we have in place are the ones that were established recently, and some of those revoked some of the earlier orders. So that's, you have to be perfectly candid on that. But the 2012 planning rule is something that has never been revoked or revised. And so that has been, that has stayed steady since 2012. And so that is not something that is, and for all intents and purposes or ostensibly political. And so for what carbon means is, when we talk about carbon, we're using, as far as using carbon versus CO2 or carbon dioxide, carbon is generally what's used in the literature in the conversation. So we're probably going to stick with that language, but what it does mean is those greenhouse gas fluxes, and carbon is sort of a shorthand because obviously there's a lot of greenhouse gases that cause the greenhouse effect and radiative forcing. There's carbon dioxide, there's methane, there's nitrous oxide, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different ones that we talk about, but generally we sort of lump them under, one of the big ones are, carbon dioxide and methane. Those are obviously carbon based. And there's a lot of flux that happens between forests and the atmosphere. And so when we're talking about carbon, and the need to analyze, we are mostly talking about what we call biogenic carbon. So the carbon that sort of exchanges between our vegetation and ecosystems and the atmosphere. So we don't have the same requirements to account for direct point source emissions like power plants or coal production or anything like that. For the most part, what we are directed to do relates to our management effect on the carbon that is stored in the ecosystem and the carbon that is absorbed or emitted from the ecosystem and from disturbances. So I hope that helps a little bit. And I mentioned in the presentation, actually, one of the considerations that we do have is in those dynamics, we do know that younger trees absorb carbon faster. However, the bigger trees store more carbon. And if you cut those and say burn them or let them decompose, they release carbon back to the atmosphere, and it's a large source. However, there's also the consideration for, long-lived wood products. Eventually, all wood products will decompose and return the carbon to the atmosphere. But on what timeline? If it's in lumber, that lasts a while, and potentially it can be offset. It can offset, emissions from steel, for example, if you're going to use it in a building. So there's all these different complex considerations in what we call a life cycle analysis of wood production and wood utilization, wood usage. And so these are all things that we need to consider when we are considering the carbon pros and cons, essentially, of our management. The other big piece of that is that carbon is not the only thing we're managing for, right? We are not a carbon management agency. We're a forest management agency. So we also have wildlife considerations. We also have economic considerations. We also have recreation considerations. And within that context, we also have considering what is our role related to carbon, so that it is just one of many, many resources that we need to consider and analyze the effects of when we consider our management. And so the agency is still writing a document on its stance on what our role in carbon stewardship is, on forest carbon stewardship. And that hasn't been finalized, but generally it tends to fall along the lines of, we generally want to be managing first for that ecosystem integrity, right? We want to manage for healthy forests first. And then from there, if there's opportunities to improve carbon storage or carbon flows that remove carbon from the atmosphere, those are things we can consider. Related to your questions about carbon crediting, as an opportunity / a fear, the carbon crediting systems that are in place I think you said that you were concerned about them being a hollow economy because they're not actually producing a good. And that is correct, but it's also a way for governments to be able to invest in mitigating social and environmental problems, right? There's a number of ways that governments do that, whether it's mitigating other environmental pollution issues or other social ills. There are certain things that happen in society that tend to be mitigated through government. So that's a way for government to be able to invest in recognizing that we have this imbalance of carbon going into the atmosphere, and how do we try to pull that out and try to store and secure it? Because we do know that climate change is happening, and it is happening because in large part due to anthropogenic reasons. And those are things that I do not shy away from, because that is the best available scientific information that we have, and that is what we are required to use. I will also say, though, that the Forest Service is generally not a great candidate for those carbon crediting mechanisms, because those carbon crediting mechanisms have a lot of requirements in place, including a big one being additionality. You have to show that what you're doing to protect that carbon is additional to what would be happening under otherwise, any management otherwise. And so it's difficult for a lot of places that are already sort of protected, that aren't subject to housing development and things like that, to be able to show that what they're doing is additional and is going to produce additional sequestered carbon. And so that's also part of what the agency is discussing in a bigger level related to carbon and a carbon stewardship approach. But that is something that we've looked into and haven't found great options related to. So, and part of that is because of that challenge that you described with incorporating all of those pieces of the carbon dynamics and the life cycle analysis. I don't know if that answers your questions enough or too much, but that's where we're at right now.
No, that's fantastic. I appreciate that. Very thorough. I'm glad that you must have the text in real time transcription. That's cool. I did have ESG. You mentioned that, and I was actually going to mention that as well, but I just kind of felt I was running my time out. But that is a significant issue that I have, concerns about as well. And quite honestly, ESG, BlackRock in general, but ESG itself has really, really suffered some huge fallout in the past few months. So again, kind of bolstering my concern about a hollow economy that's based on ESG and these other like you mentioned, it's beyond carbon, it's social ills, and we're getting into really crossing into other Bill of Rights infringements that are based on this ESG thing. Well, thankfully, as far as I'm concerned, anyway, it's kind of falling apart right now. So again, it just illustrates, that it's an unstable political hot button issue, and so I really appreciate your feedback on that, and I will get out of everybody's way and listen.
All right, thank you, Johnny. I just want to jump into our last question before we run out of time here, Kiana, if that sounds good. We have a question, says, how does the plan balance the impacts and at times competing interests of industry and development pressures with climate change goals, such as carbon, ecology, sustainability? I think you might have touched on this a little bit, but.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's something that I'm sure we'll navigate throughout the process. Like I said, we're still at the very beginning. And so I'm sure that, any plan development that we do, there will be plenty of people watching from the outside and saying, hey, I think you're leaning too heavily in one direction or the other. Or this sounds a little bit too much like, an industry, direction, things like that. But ultimately, the 2012 planning rule, which is the step down guidance for the actual law that we need to follow, wants us to focus on ecosystem integrity and sustainability. So that's our first and foremost goal. And then within that, we also have mandates to provide, industry product for forestry. And we also have guidance to consider climate change goals and carbon. And so the question is really going to be, how do we balance those? Or are they not in, they may be congruous as well. And so that's something that we'll suss out through the assessment process. We'll get public feedback on that. We'll get public feedback on our plan as well. And so if folks see something or they see, scientific literature that sounds like it's something that we should have incorporated or considered, that's something that we're hoping that we will get. But again, with everything, this is sort of the $1 million question. Both, are these interests at odds, for one? And if they are, what is more important, and sort of how do we weigh that? And that's a values judgment, right? That we consider through the plan development process. And that's part of why we consider different alternatives, right? And in a plan revision, you'll often see, here's alternative A, B, C, D, and one might be the I've worked on plan revisions in the lower 48 where wildfire risk is a big issue. So you have the more conservative, hands-off approach, and then you have the one that's, more assertive as far as trying to do forest restoration, but involves short-term trade-offs. So you might have different alternatives that lay out these options, and then from those, our deciding official will choose based in part on what our analysis shows might be the pros and cons. And so that's the really simple answer. I don't know if you had any particular follow-up or concern with that, or if we have time.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but that doesn't limit any feedback and or questions that people have that you want to submit to us. Erin Lynn did put both our emails as well as the Tongass Plan Revision email address in the chat. So Johnny too, if there's additional follow-up that you would like to do, definitely you can submit those through those email addresses. It looks like that question was answered for the last one as well. But Kiana, if you'll go to the next slide. So I just want to highlight, if you do want to stay engaged and up to date with the opportunities for engagement as we move through this revision, which I mentioned is a multi-year process, please do so. This is a screenshot from our website where you can enter in your email address and submit it to get on the email list. This is not like a junk email that you're going to get tons of emails, just when there's pertinent upcoming events and or opportunities for commenting. So just to keep you up to date and in the loop of what we got going on. So next slide. And then just to highlight, we do have revision office hours, both the first Tuesday of the month and the third Tuesday of the month, both a morning and an evening option. So if you want to have audience with that revision team for additional questions or feedback, we will be there for that purpose. So just an informal opportunity, no presentation or anything, just there for questions and conversation. Next slide. And just to highlight, our revision website does have a lot of buttons, but under that media library, you can find our webinar recordings from this webinar and previous ones that we've had, and some short clips as well. The question and answers that I brought up during these webinars are also saved under the public engagement section, along with our upcoming opportunities. And then also some great information in our revision document library for you to check out as well. Next slide. If you were not able to make it to our community workshops, please grab this QR code. It is our partner put it together for you to provide that input, and Erin Lynn also put that into the chat too. You can grab it that way as well, but just another way for you to provide input during this assessment phase of our process. But I think we went a little out of time here, so thank you very much for joining us this evening, and please feel free to reach out if we were unable to have time to address any other questions that you might have had. But thank you very much for your engagement in this revision process and for joining us this evening. Have a great evening.